37 millimeter. What is 37 millimeter used for? Well, really nothing in modern day, right? Not true. We have 37 millimeter 37 millimeter rounds as well as 37 millimeter projectile launchers. Now, the primary use of these is civilian, and that the 37 millimeter was originally designed was because of a special treaty and the amount of explosives that were allowed and what size of projectile it was allowed in based on weight of explosive. That's because exploding bullets are inhumane. So, enter Mr. Hotchkiss here, makes his 37 millimeter. And, of course, his cannon and his ammunition becomes world famous. Lots of people like to use it. Not sure if you noticed, but the Hotchkiss revolving cannon looks kind of like a Gatling gun. By the way, as long as you don't have the ammunition in it, you can buy a Hotchkiss revolving cannon, even if you were a felon. Yeah. Unmodified in firing condition. Matter of fact, you can get ammunition for it that even as a felon you can fire out of it. Why is that? Because they only make civilian ammunition, and civilian ammunition is very specifically used for what? It's not used for crowd suppression. It's used for entertainment. You're firing literally fireworks rounds. Different fireworks effects. If you're using a Hotchkiss revolving cannon, the reason that they do these things during the daylight is because it's a historical piece of equipment. They want people to be able to take pictures and actually look at the historical piece of equipment. However, if you own one, chances are pretty good that you already know it's a historical piece of equipment. You've got plenty of pictures already online. What you're doing is you're throwing a party, and you're going out there with 2 to 3 boxes worth of fireworks ammunition that you're going to fire out of your Hotchkiss. Now, we got to talk about the RPGs now, don't we? There were Hotchkiss that were made in 40 millimeter. That's a military round. Pretty much anything that you find in 40 millimeter is going to be military. At one point in time, there was a RPG-2, I believe. The RPG-2 came in 37 millimeter for about 2 weeks. That's because at the time, 37 millimeter internal diameter was a pretty standard tube size all across Europe. But the 40 millimeter was, well, it was compatible with a lot of ammunition that they had at the time that was designed for 40 millimeter guns, things that are a little bit bigger. When it came to the RPG-7, the RPG-7 and the RPG-2 were very different. The RPG-7 had rocket nozzles on it, whereas the RPG-2 functioned exactly the same as a Panzerfaust. That's a World War II single-shot anti-tank device. It was often used as an anti-infantry device, and it excelled in that role. When you look at the numbers of Panzerfaust given out versus the numbers written down as expended versus the numbers that are still missing, you realize that there are literally hundreds of thousands hundreds of thousands of Panzerfausts that are not accounted for. All 40 millimeter. The Panzerfaust was able to fire different sized warheads, was also able to take different sized charges based on the thickness of the metal tube that they fired with. And now I'm going to show you the designs for those. This right here, you see what I have in my hand? You see that? That is the primary component of a shape charge. Air. Well, rather an empty space filled with air. There's no other materials in there, just air. That's right, air. That means you can have a huge projectile, huge, that doesn't weigh hardly anything at all. Out of that Hotchkiss revolving cannon, you wouldn't be able to fire most of the ammunition that we have today. However, there is a universal launcher designed by the Chinese, very cool piece of implementation. It's got an optional venturi on the back, but it's recommended that you don't use the venturi. This is a nozzle that closes it up just a little bit. The problem with the venturi is that it makes it so that it goes from being recoilless to recoiling quite a bit, depending on which projectile you stick in it. But it's two-piece telescoping tube with the external tube, its internal diameter being 40 millimeter. The secondary tube is basically the nozzle exhaust. Now you slide one out of the other. It's designed so that you can fire 40 millimeter ammunition, be it American 40 millimeter, British 40 millimeter, Russian 40 millimeter, Chinese 40 millimeter, or all variants of 40 millimeter rocket launchers. How do they do this? Multi-stage firing pins. One-piece multi-stage. It's a very interesting system, and it's not capable of firing unless it is fully extended and locked in the safety position. And it's simple. I looked at it and I was like, you know what? They have a bunch of extraneous shit on here, but literally you could do this with two pieces of pipe, one trigger assembly unit, and a fucking rubber band. And part of the way that they do that is by heating and expanding a portion of it after assembling it. Basically, they make it so the two tubes will only slide over each other one way. And then they heat up the rear end of another one, the rearmost one. They heat it up, and while it's heated up red hot, it's slightly crimped, just barely. And that slight crimping prevents it from sliding back off. It's amazing how heating things up and cooling them off can make such a difference. Whereas the Americans, when we decided to do something similar, ours was a two-piece fold-over with a bunch of complicated pieces of crap involved, most of them aluminum. Ugh. Aluminum is low melting temperature, but it also has high heat dispersion, which means if you make it thick enough, theoretically it shouldn't melt anyway because it disperses too quickly. Like 3 times faster than steel. It's also only a third the weight, which is pretty nice as well. Now with the RPG-2, the reason they changed over to 40 millimeter is only in part because of that situation. 37 millimeter isn't exactly a popular round these days. Even in World War II, it wasn't exactly a popular round. the things that it was popular in was aircraft. And one of the reasons that they were considering using 37 millimeter as Russians was because the Germans had so much 37 millimeter ammunition. But then, of course, when you start looking at the 37 millimeter ammunition that the Russians or the Germans used, a lot of it was electrically primed. You had to put an electric charge through it to fire it. So it just became a big confusing mess. Now the Chinese piece of equipment it's trash. You could literally build it in your garage. I could literally build it in my car if I had two pieces of equipment, a hacksaw. I do have a hacksaw. That's one piece of equipment I'd need to make it. Number two, I'd need a torch. Do I have a torch? I have a pocket torch in here somewhere, and actually that would work well enough to perform the function because of the tight tolerances and using telescoping tube. Now, all these different implements that go into the Chinese one are all different. I mean, when you're talking about an American-made 40 millimeter grenade launcher, you're talking about a projectile. The case and the projectile are about that big. It's about that big around. It's not very large. But then you're talking about an RPG too. You're talking about a projectile that's like that long. Plus, it's got a booster charge on it that's that long. So, I mean, literally, this thing is like that long. It's fucking huge. I guess I can't get my fingers far enough to spread. It's really long. It's about the length of 3 sections of this. So we'll take the last section of my cane. This is about the length of it overall. You've got the booster charge. That's the thing that initially goes off. Or no, the firing charge, then the booster charge, and the impact charge would be here. And then, of course, from here to here would be the head of it. That's on an RPG-2. On an RPG-7, it's going to be even longer than that. Now, what that means is they have to have... What that means, they have multiple locations where there's basically a little nail or a pin sticking up through it, through holes that are in it, so that no matter where it's at, it's going to impact it. Let's say you have a, well, what they showed is a strip of spring steel with what looked to be nails through the spring steel. And that goes up next to it in the trigger housing. Now the trigger housing is long enough that it extends to where all of those different holes would be. And then, of course, it's got an insert in the front, because some of the original RPGs will only line up one way. This isn't actually rocket-propelled grenade launcher in most situations. For example, the RPG-7, that's not a grenade. That's an actual shape-charged warhead. That's not a grenade. It is absolutely rocket-propelled, but that's not the initial charge. The initial charge is still a black powder charge, or a similar incendiary, a similar non-incendiary round. I mean, obviously it's got flames, but it's not meant to be a fire. It's meant to be a propellant. And, well, with a lot of the stuff that we design today, it's designed so that it won't even start the rocket until it's been out of the tube quite a ways. Some of you might have seen those M-Law rockets being fired, and you notice they hold them up at an angle, and the rocket comes out at an angle, and then it kind of drops down a little bit, and that's when the rocket motor or the booster charge gets started. Lighthouse Society type good morning from San Francisco. Good morning, Lighthouse Society. Welcome back. Now, one of the things that's important about 37 millimeter, and the reason that I bring it up, is specifically because of civilian use, and also because flares scare the living fuck out of people. No joke. Oh, boogers. I saw a guy get pissed off at a lake once and fire one of those at some people. Well, not at them. He fired it in their general direction. One thing I didn't realize about those flare launchers is that when they land in the water, they keep on burning. Like, you can light up the whole lake with a strobe with one of those things. Lighthouse Society typed, I'm glad you remember me. Well, how would I not remember you? You just fucking typed at me yesterday. Not sure if you noticed, I'm not popular and I'm kind of an asshole. You're welcome for remembered you. With world destabilization right now, and Americans spending stupid money on stupid shit, it's important to know your weapons. It's important to know what you're allowed to have and what you're not. 37 millimeter rockets, you can buy those standard as Estes rockets. You also can fill up to 4 ounces in a nose cone. That's pretty friggin' significant. If you get a bigger rocket, you can fill up more than that. The AP round, that's the anti-personnel round, for a RPG-2 or RPG-7. It's not much bigger than this. Just a little bit bigger. It's basically a whole bunch of shrapnel. They got 2 different types of shrapnel. You have close-in shrapnel. That's generally flat pieces of shrapnel or washers, things of that nature. Stuff it's going to have a lot of velocity to begin with, but it's going to slow down in travel, and usually by about 20 meters or so, it's going too slow to do any real damage, unless a piece happens to fly out at a flat trajectory. If you want it to go long range, though, fucking flies. God damn you, dude. Get the hell out of here. Ugh, those things bug the shit out of me. They look just like bees. And they bite hard, apparently. So the 37 millimeter, a lot of civilian rounds are in 37 millimeter. There's a company in Washington State where you can get all sorts of party favors in 37 millimeter, and as long as you have Lighthouse Society type nature's projectile. Yeah, so is camel spit. Well, bastard. Oh, that's an actual bee. That's not a fly, that is an actual bee. And he found his own way out of my vehicle. So getting back to 37 millimeter versus 40 millimeter, what's the difference? You can hand load your own rounds either way. If you get busted with either one of them, load it up, you're gonna get in a fucking shit ton of trouble. However, if you've got a 37 millimeter and the only rounds that you have for it are party rounds, it's easy to convert those party rounds. It's a matter of just taking out the projectile and inserting a different one. Some of the Titan twist, this is basically, you've got an egg-shaped projectile or an egg-shaped grenade, and when you put it in there, you're just putting it in hand tight. For a lot of these, you notice that it's got the 37 millimeter, but it's a plastic casing, a dark burgundy plastic, and then the grenade for it is literally a length of tube, cardboard tube, inserted into the end of it. That's because the cardboard tube is intended to burn up during the launch. Now, the Russians, they have a really good program for utilizing NATO ammunition. Sure, their guns aren't made to fire NATO ammunition, but they're made to fire NATO ammunition in a pinch. That's why they select the ammunition types that they do. The 9mm Luger Parabellum round. The Germans, if they took over British positions or American positions, they knew that there was a possibility they were going to end up with some 9mm ammunition off of the officers or out of ammunition dumps. Later on in the war, they were certain that they were going to get 9mm off of any and all paratroopers until the American grease gun. That's because the Sten gun was so popular, as well as 11 different knockoff models used by various nations, both friend and enemy alike. Even the Germans made a knockoff of the Sten Mark II. So you're able to take your enemy's ammunition and use it. Well, nobody could do that with the Russian ammunition because they used 9mm Makarov, 8mm Makarov, and 7mm Sudiev. Is that correct? Probably not. I'm not as up to date on Russian ammunition types as I am on American. But they weren't interchangeable. As far as communist bloc nations, the Russians insisted that anybody that was part of the Warsaw Pact use particular types of ammunition that were Russian standard. And as a result, even during the Vietnam War, when a lot of soldiers had captured French guns, they had to convert them so that they could utilize ammunition that the Russians had. Now, there wasn't none of this, all right, well, you've got a 9mm French MAP 49 that you captured on a battlefield Vietnam, and you captured it as a Vietnam soldier from the French during their attempt at continuing occupation after World War II. It failed miserably. America got involved, and we ended up having to deal with 7mm Makarov pistol rounds fired out of the MAP 49, and it was definitely not something Americans liked. As Americans, there's a lot of stuff that we are not going to see in our lifetimes that it is illegal for us to have. Despite our great and mighty Second Amendment, you can get guns, full auto guns, easily in a lot of third world countries, a lot of second world countries, and even many first world countries. A lot easier than you can get one in the United States. When the government starts restricting the people's right to bear arms, be it swords in the 1400s to destructive devices today, when the government starts restricting the people's allowances, tolerances for having the ability to defend themselves and to protect themselves, and you put that solely on the government claims that they're going to do it. They're going to take your taxes to protect you, but they're going to protect and serve the shit out of you the same way the mob does. You pay them the protection money, maybe they won't fuck with you as much. Anyway, I gotta try to make enough money to pay a bill. I still haven't made it to Portland. I do need to make it there. I highly recommend looking up various paintball guns. The reason for this is because paintball guns, some of them have canisters on them that will hold up to 2,000 to 3,000 pounds of pressure. What that means is that you can fire a 50 BMG round pretty efficiently. You can also fire lightweight projectiles pretty efficiently. You can find the recipes for all this stuff on the internet pretty easily. What are the chances of getting red flagged for it? Well, as an American, you've probably researched enough about that, even if you hate guns, to be red flagged, and you haven't been arrested yet, have you? It's not as if you're on Paladin Press's preferred customer list. When it comes to 37mm projectiles, you can get a lot of different stuff in 37mm. You can get a lot of different ammunition for 37mm. And just like with 40mm, you can hand load your own. The difference is the 40mm is a felony for you as an American to own. The 37mm is not. If you wanted to buy that Hotchkiss revolving cannon and put it in your living room as a display, you could. If you wanted to have that thing along with hundreds of dummy rounds, you could. If you wanted to have powder charges that you could put into it immediately, you could. If you wanted to have preloaded grenades with chalk in them, you could. Whereas a 3mm difference, matter of fact, even a 1mm difference, 38mm becomes a felony. So the tolerances that are allowed for a 37mm allow it to be 37 to 38mm. But you need to stop at 37.9mm. You can protect yourself, you can protect your family, you can do so with a flare. Keep in mind that things are very dry this day and age. So you better be prepared to go try to put that out. Many flares are water resistant. There's a couple of road flares, matter of fact, that truckers use that's pretty common. And it's got a waxy substance around the outside of it. Now that waxy substance prevents it from obviously getting wet on the inside. But also it burns so hot that as you are trying to pour water over it, the heat is going to push all of the water out of the way. The heat never actually touches it, or the water never actually touches it. So the best that you can do in that situation is to douse it, yes, but also douse the entire area where it's going to burn, because it may burn for the full 15 minutes. Some of them I've seen that burn for 45 minutes. I even saw a flare only this long. Here, hold on. That long. This is smaller than most road flares. Burns for an hour and a half. An hour and a half. That is a super short flare for something that burns for an hour and a half. I don't have the cash, obviously, to buy one of those. One of the other things that you can keep in mind as an American is that you can always have a tube in 40mm for anything that you have in 37mm that you happen to make yourself. Having the tube with none of the parts attached is not against the law. As long as all of your stuff is attached to the 37mm tube, you are good to go. If it was around World War II, that 37mm would be a pretty common round, and it might be a popular option to go with if you've got something capable of holding it. The thing is that when they made the RPG-2, they designed it so that it would fire 40mm. That's the same that the Germans used on their Panzerfaust. All of them had a 40mm tube. The RPG-7, 40mm tube. the French version of the RPG-7, 40 millimeter tube, the South African version of the RPG-2, 40 millimeter tube, the Russian RPG-2, 40 millimeter tube. 40 millimeter ammunition is a lot more common today than 37 millimeter. The 37 millimeter that you would fire out of a World War II cannon. Well, this is a cannon because of the caliber of round that it's firing, not that it's some ground-bound cannon. Most of what the Germans fired was cannons. The majority of what the Japanese fired was cannons. If it hits you, it tears you open. But if you fire one of those out of a Hotchkiss revolving cannon, the first thing you're going to notice is that it doesn't fire. It's electrically primed. So then you have to convert your Hotchkiss revolving cannon so that it's going to fire it electronically. Then there's the fact that there is a much bigger difference between black powder and the like. That's a low-grade propellant. That's what you used in old firearms, was literally black powder. The very first primed cartridges used black powder. The first full-cased cartridges, black powder. We didn't end up with Pyrex until years later. And there's also the yellow shit, cordite, that's used now. Yellowish orange. It's about the color of a carrot. That stuff expands a lot more rapidly, and if you were to fire a 37 millimeter round out of a Hotchkiss, it would blow up your Hotchkiss. There's also the fact that it's a tapered round, whereas the Hotchkiss did not fire those style of tapered rounds. 40 millimeters, the majority of stuff that we have in 40 millimeter is not tapered. So there's a possibility that if you build it heavy duty enough, then you can use the same RPG tube that you use for firing your RPG-7 or your RPG-2. You can also, if you need to, make it a single shot weapon to fire 40 millimeter rounds. But how do you do that? That's the part that it was showing on the Chinese thing. It's a spoon. It's literally a spoon. It's a spoon with a little hook on the end of it. And what it does is when you pull the trigger on the ones that are fired from center, it slaps it up and it slaps the back of the 40 millimeter right in the primer, like American grenade launchers use. Smacks it right in the primer. And then, of course, that tube, that round is going to want to go backwards. So it slides that tube, or that spoon, back so that it's flat and flush the way that it should be. And the 40 millimeter grenade goes one direction, and the back end of the cartridge goes another. Now then, there's, of course, the Chinese version of it that has a very similar thing, except for theirs, you feel the full recoil. They actually have to have a piece that comes down, folds down rear ways forward. That way you can set it on your shoulder and help to absorb some of the 40 millimeter. And anybody who has ever fired a 40 millimeter knows that's not what you want to do. You'll break yourself. So this Chinese thing, with all of its great ideas, does have some flaws in the design. You can't make something that's going to fire every type of round out there. What you can do is design something or procure things for your specific use. Here in the United States, we have no need for a 40 millimeter. As civilians, the majority of what we're going to be using would be party rounds. This is stuff that fires a bunch of flame out the other end, or some of the 37 millimeter rounds fire confetti. Some of them fire basically multicolored rolls of toilet paper. I mean, There's a lot of different stuff you can do with those. And also, they still have the added use of being still used as far as marine use that's on the water, not as in the United States Marine Corps. But they're used as signal rounds. You fire different colored signal flares into the air. Some of them, they're made so they'll go up just like your Estes rocket. They'll go up way up in the air off of the rocket power. When they get way the hell up there, they'll pop the top off of them, and that'll deploy a parachute. And then it brings it down slowly, and it's right after the parachute is deployed, that's actually the tension that starts the flare, which is pretty cool. Now, as I was looking through my technology, I made Trash to Treasure as an airplane enthusiast, right? And at one point in time, I was trying to find civilian uses for a lot of military stuff, but then you realize that military stuff is so specific that it's basically trash for civilian use. Sure, you can take the turret off of a tank, take all the ammunition out of it, put a PTO shaft on the back, and go driving through a field in it to drag everything that you would do with your combine. But it's heavy, it's going to get bogged down, and it's even going to be more expensive on gas than your combine. So, realistically, what use do you have for a tank? Now, you can take the turret off of it, and you can put a winch on the top, or you can put a crane on the top. Those are excellent ideas for a tank, especially with the sheer quantity of weight that's on them. But also, you have to have a block area, which means you have to add more stuff to it, so you can add those blocks so that you can extend them from inside of the tank so you can remain safe while you're lifting and carrying heavy loads. And really, we've got stuff that's already treads and tracks that you can put a crane to anyway, so there's no reason to convert them. We've already got stuff that is better for civilian use than the military stuff. .37 millimeter, you can make pretty much everything that they make in 40 millimeter, and you can make it yourself, same as you can make the stuff with 40 millimeter. But you're not going to fucking prison for making something in 37 millimeter. That's the kicker right there. The other thing is, one of the great things about 37 millimeter, part of the reason that it's still legal and really nothing else is because you can't find ammunition for it. You literally have to make your own ammunition for it, or you're getting a party favor. If you make a 37 millimeter gun, you can literally sell it to a 5-year-old. You can sell it to a felon. If you got a guy that you literally just met today, and he tells you that he got out of prison yesterday for murdering 10 people with a shotgun, you can still legally sell him your 37 millimeter. Just don't sell him the ammunition. And you're not breaking the law. It's the same as selling somebody a candy bar or a hamburger or your old roller skates from 1986 at a garage sale. It's no different. No paperwork, nothing required transferable. It's not considered a destructive device, and if you do have a destructive device for it, it's the ammunition, and that ammunition, because of its caliber, is considered the destructive device. Alright, now that we've filled you with a bunch of stupidity and ignorance, and also a bunch of stuff about the laws here in the United States, those of you who are in other countries, I'm sorry about all the fuck nuggetry today. However, Americans don't have access to RPG-7s. They don't have them in common use in their country. So a lot of the stuff that you might have behind your door, like an RPG-7 or an RPG-2, that everybody knows not to fuck with because it's not a toy. Here in America, we've got a lot of farmers who have a gun behind the door. A 22 long rifle usually, oftentimes a 30-06, depending on how far out in the country. But the fact is that it's there, it's not messed with. It's just like the RPG sitting behind your door. Everybody in the house knows that it's not a toy. Everybody in the house knows it's not to be fucked with. Everybody in the house is aware of how potentially dangerous it is, and it is not a novelty to you. It's a tool just like everything else in the house. Just like a 22 long rifle or a 30-06 next to the door here in America is a pretty common thing. The people who are most likely to have an issue are the ones who treat it like a novelty but have no education whatsoever. It's not that I want you and your kids to know how to go on a mass shooting. It's that you never know when a situation is going to arise where maybe it's not what you wanted, but you're in the situation nonetheless. It'd be a better thing for you to understand the business end of the pointy thing instead of having to learn it while getting shot at, while people are trying to stab you, while people are throwing grenades at you, and while the person who just handed you a firearm in the hopes that you'll be able to defend yourself, well, while he's making sure that you have that gun and know how to use it, and he's showing you everything on it so that you don't end up accidentally shooting yourself or everybody in there, he's not on the firing line. You got one less person who's firing back. That means that your opponent, who wants you dead, is continuing to advance. They're losing less men on the advance because instead of having you and your buddy on the firing line, you've got two people off the firing line. Two people less defending that defensible position. See, in modern warfare, in order to take over a defended position, unlike an old fortress, in an old fortress, you would need anywhere from 10 to 12 to 1 ratio in order to storm a fortress. On a modern battlefield, you're talking about a 3 to 1 ratio. That's because of airburst munitions. This is a lot of stuff that you get into 40 millimeter about. A lot of the modern ammunition, a lot of this really cool new stuff that is going to fire and explode at a particular distance. All of that new technology is being made in 40 millimeter, not 37 millimeter. So you're never going to have access to that kind of technology. But if you've got the simple ability to make your own black powder, or somewhere nearby where you can buy black powder, you will never run out of ammunition because you can custom load and reload as many times as you want, especially if you order stainless steel casings. These are a little bit thicker than most casings. This means that you can pack a little bit less volume worth of black powder into them. But here's again another big but. Most of the space in there isn't utilized anyway. A lot of the reason that it's made the way that it is so that you can use a sabot round, or so that you can use a cup spacer like on a shotgun, similar to on a shotgun. You've got basically the egg. The egg sits on top of a little rubber piece that'll take some of the impact so that it doesn't just smash in the back end of your projectile and force it to mushroom out, getting it stuck in the chamber and possibly exploding on you. And it pushes it out. That basically separates immediately on leaving the barrel, but that's the reason there's extra space in there. That's why you still put wadding in a modern 40 millimeter. Back in the day, it would have been a piece of cloth or a piece of paper. Today, it's a piece of plastic. There's several soda pop caps that work excellent for that, by the way. Anyway, good to be with you. Thanks for coming to visit. Stay out of trouble or don't get caught. Remember, you are your brother's keeper, and your sister's too, and no victim left behind. Also, flares get pretty fucking hot. If I was a police officer, I wouldn't want to get shot in the chest with a flare. I wouldn't want to get shot in the chest with anything that could literally burrow its way through my chest.